Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me at this Center for Trust Studies. As some of you might know, I've been studying trust since my PhD. And today yeah, as also discussed, I want to give kind of an overview, but let's say then also message for, let's say, future research that I think is important. And let's say the bottom line is, as the title says, on the interdependent effects of social environment and empathy on trust. Yeah, a lot of the work is collaboration with many colleagues in Utrecht or other places, but I want to mention especially Werner Raup, with whom I did a lot of this research. So let me see. Yes. Now, of course, we are at the trust center, so I assume you know to some extent what is trust, but of course, there are also different definitions. So let me walk you through how I consider trust in this talk. And first, an example, and also to related to my game theoretic approach that I use a lot. Uh, let's imagine you want to buy this secondhand book. Yeah, let's say the very old first book on game theory from von Neumann and Morgenstern. And you can buy this first edition for quite some money, certainly if it's signed by John Neumann for himself from some bookseller. And you can read this description and look at the picture, but then are you going to send this large amount of money, 125,000 euros, to buy this book? Do you trust this supplier enough, let's say, to see whether he will send the book? Yeah, let's say that this will requires some trust for you. I think it's not so much a question. And let's say that this the important feature is also that, of course, the supplier has, if he has received the money, an incentive not to send the book, or let's say an incentive to pretend that he has this book, but then has a much less valuable copy that he's going to send to you. Yeah, so these are some of the key features of a trust problem. And you could translate that in a simple trust game that is probably also familiar to you, where the buyer is the truster and the supplier is the trustee. And the key features, as I said, are the temptation for the supplier, which is the highest incentive for the supplier, let's say, to abuse the trust of the buyer if this would be a one-shot, one-off game. Because the other important feature is that both trustee and truster are better off if trust is placed and honored compared to the situation that there is no trust. Yeah, and this is, of course, the social dilemma setting. How is it possible that people get to the place trust and honor trust situation? And how might that work through social embeddedness conditions? Let's say this is the question that I will address. And think, yeah, I illustrated to some extent how you can see a buyer-supplier relation as a trust game. Actually, the way it's mostly implemented also in the empirical research we did in surveys is that, let's say, the no trust situation we see as a situation where buyer and seller spend a lot of time on contracting, writing out the details, what should be all the conditions, while the trust situation is that they basically agree on a deal by handshake, trusting that they understand each other, what they want to have, and how it will be delivered, without spending a lot of resources on such a contract. And on the trustee side, let's say, quite as I indicated it for this book, let's say the honoring trust situation is that you really get the book as it was on the website with exactly these properties and delivered in due time. Yeah, while abuse of trust, you get an inferior book, what's delivered with a considerable delay. Yeah, so this is the abstract situation translated to a concrete example of an interaction. Now, what can now help trust and trustworthiness in this game, in this interaction, in terms of social embeddedness? And let's say, uh, from my early work on, you might know that I have been focusing on these four mechanisms. Yeah, that are at two levels. So you can have embeddedness at the dyadic level. So you don't have one transaction with the same supplier only once, but you have repeated interactions with the same supplier multiple times. And the other level of embeddedness is network embeddedness. So you are not the only buyer buying from that supplier, but you know other buyers who potentially also buy from the same supplier or have been buying in the past from the same supplier, where you can get information. Now, these are dyadic embeddedness and network embeddedness. And then there are two mechanisms through which this embeddedness can affect trust. And the first one is related to the past. Yeah, this is what we call learning. So you can have information on earlier transactions of that supplier from your own experience. And if they were good, you're going to increase your trust in that supplier. Yeah, and in the same way, you can have information from other buyers about that supplier who had experiences in the past. And if these are positive, it can increase your trust in that supplier. Yeah, and I want to explicitly disentangle this mechanism from what I call the control, or you could also call it the reputation mechanism. And this mechanism is towards the future. Yeah, maybe you didn't have any relationship before, but you know you're going to buy from that supplier multiple times, and the supplier knows that as well. Yeah, so then the supplier should realize, if he doesn't behave appropriately the first time, you will probably not trust anymore in later transactions, which will also be costly for that supplier. So based on that anticipation, the buyer can trust the supplier also in the very first transaction without knowing anything about that supplier beforehand. Yeah, and you can also think of tit for tat mechanisms that both realize beforehand. So if you are not trustworthy, uh, you get punished by not placing trust in the next iteration. And the same mechanism you can translate then or multiply basically through the network. And say, if the seller knows that you know a lot of buyers that are also planning to buy from that seller, and but you can tell these buyers your experience, this seller has an additional incentive to perform well, so that you can put forward this positive information. And he should also realize, if he performs badly, that the other buyers will probably also not want to buy any more from that seller. Yeah, so we have two levels, and we have this past and this future related mechanisms. But if you look at interactions, let's say through time, it's often very difficult to disentangle all these mechanisms. But in my past research, I think we were quite successful in disentangling these mechanisms. Yeah, I'm not going in detail on all the exact theoretical derivations of these hypotheses. I think, as I explained, and they're also quite intuitive, but maybe it's good just to realize that they can also be derived more formally from game theoretic models or agent-based models that work more on learning mechanisms. Now, any type of hypothesis that can directly follow from this, let's say positive information has positive effect on trust of the truster, and expected future transactions with the same person have an effect on trust, as well as on trustworthiness of the seller. Yeah, and note, we do not talk about learning effects on the trustworthiness, because the trustee in the trust game, let's say, uh, he has the last move. Yeah, so he has not really much learning opportunity within that game. While the truster, let's say, he's unsure about what the trustee is going to do. So his experience are valuable to predict what in the next move might happen. Yeah, so you see that also for network embeddedness, positive information through the network is going to increase trust, and network reputation mechanisms can increase trust as well as trustworthiness. Now, what kind of evidence did we develop on these type of hypotheses? Let's say, and yeah, again, let's say I summarize very quickly now a large amount of evidence just to get also to the more general message at the end. And uh, and let's say also to show you the extra value of having these many studies. Yeah, because we did complementary research designs to study the same hypothesis that I just introduced in different methodologies. Yeah, we did surveys among buyers and suppliers. We asked them about their transactions, how they went, let's say, how their embeddedness was arranged, and then try to measure the trust levels by looking at the contracts. Yeah, but in surveys, you can imagine it's very difficult to measure some of these concepts. You say, how do you exactly measure the networks of the buyers of one supplier? So that was one of the definitely the issues. But you might also have selectivity or androgeneity effects because the actual transactions that you see, they require already a minimal level of trust. Yeah, so then you have some selection also on your key variables. Yeah, but the nice thing is these are real interactions, real contracts. That's the real behavior of people in the real world. Yeah, and but the complementary methodologies are then more the experimental methodologies where you have control over your variables. You do not have so much measurement issues of the variable because in the lab you just construct, let's say, how long people are interacting with each other, who can exchange information with whom, so you know exactly the network context. Of course, these are abstract trust games and you have some external validity problem. In the vignette studies, kind of in between, because you have a real story about a real transaction, and that are also evaluated by real salespeople who do this every day, and you manipulate, let's say, this hypothetical transaction, how it looks like in terms of embeddedness. Yeah, but still, it's not a real transaction because these people get a story and they have to make a hypothetical guess, let's say, what they would do in that situation. Yeah, while the experiments in the lab, they have direct financial consequences. Yeah, so these are not hypothetical interactions. If you do bad in trust games, you earn much less money than if trust and trustworthiness, in a sense, is flourishing. Yeah, so uh, let's say, but by having all the methodology, we kind of replicate results on the same hypotheses. Yeah, every time we test exactly the same set of hypotheses, but with these different methodologies. And we can see whether the same results replicate. And to some extent, replication has become more important recently. Uh, Mostly people then talk about, let's say, like precise replication. Yeah, exact replication. You do the same experiment again, and you can see whether you have the same result again. Yeah, let's say that's also an important setup, but I think it's more restrictive than what we do. Because what we do, we call it replication plus, or it's also called in the literature conceptual replication. You have the same hypothesis, then different designs, different contexts, different populations also of people involved. And let's say, of course, if you have consistent results, you can say, okay, it's not only in this context where it works, but it works in different contexts with different groups. On the other hand, if you have inconsistent results, you can think theoretically also further on the differences between the contexts, the differences between the people, what might affect, let's say, the results that you have. Now let's go to the summary of the results. Yeah, so we have the three types of studies, and let's say for all the studies, we did the dyadic learning and dyadic control effects. Now, in all of these studies, it's very consistent. We find, yeah, that if people have positive past experiences, there's more trust. But we also very consistently find if people expect more transactions in the future, yeah, the control is the same partner, yeah, they have more trust, and the trustee is also more trustworthy. Yeah, so at the dyadic level, we find full support for our hypothesis. But now we go to the network level. Also, the network learning effect. So if people get positive information from their network, they're going to trust more. Yeah, and we find that in the lab, we find it in the vignette experiments. We do not find it quite well in the survey. But let's say there we still had a feeling that, as I said in the beginning, the measurement issue was still a problem. But then if we go to the network control effect, we see something very surprising. Yeah, we do not, in none of these studies, we find convincing evidence for network control effects on the truster. Trusters are not trusting more if they have a good network around them that through which they can distort the reputation of the trustee. Yeah, of course, at the point they get positive information, it's going to increase trust, but they do not anticipate on this reputation potential beforehand. On the other hand, which makes the result more surprising, is that the trustees, the suppliers, they do react on network control. Yeah, if they see that they are playing with trusters, with a network through which their reputation can be damaged, they are more trustworthy, they deliver products with less problems, and so on and so on in these contexts, which would imply that actually the trusters could trust the trustees more in the network context, but they don't. Yeah, and this is kind of the puzzle that this whole line of literature led to. Yeah, trustees see this reputation effect on the network. Yeah, but trusters do not anticipate on this. And initially we thought, yeah, maybe there's something with the data or the measurement, but for two reasons, that is now a less plausible explanation. First, because if it was a measurement problem, it should also not work for the trustee because these are the same measurements of the network. And let's say if it was a measurement problem, let's say it is also some of the studies where the measurement problems are bigger, more likely that you don't find it than in the other studies. Yeah, so we need to search for a more theoretical explanation of this puzzle. And we then come to an idea that it might have to do with strategic rationality. And why does this differentiate between trustees and trusters? Because for the trustee, thinking about their reputation is just kind of thinking one step ahead. Yeah, you deliver a bad product and you get punished. For the truster, this is an additional step of arguing. Yeah, you trust, and then you anticipate that the trustee anticipates that if he sells a bad product, then he gets punished. Yeah, so this additional thinking step, let's say, even if trusters and trustee are in a sense equally smart, then still you would expect trustees to anticipate this earlier than trusters. Yeah, now the question is, how can we then, let's say, going to study this new hypothesis that is extension of the theory furthermore? Yeah, so the limited rationality you might try to solve kind of by thinking as some people maybe look ahead more than others. Some people are more able to anticipate than others. And if we measure that in the individual people, we might find for the very anticipating group that there we do find the network control effect. We try some of these measurements, but this didn't really come out, let's say. And so let's say in this way, we couldn't find support for that new hypothesis. The other idea that we had was, okay, then we let them play this game, the same game, many, many times in a row. Yeah, so then they get experience, and the trusters might actually learn, let's say, other type of learning over experience, that these trustees are actually more trustworthy in a network condition. Yeah, but even after 10, 15 repetitions of the same repeated game, yeah, this anticipation doesn't seem to grow. Still too difficult. And the last thing that we tried here, uh, also related to the literature, let's say if people think themselves on how to manage cooperation problems, yeah, they understand, they also realize the mechanisms better. Yeah, so if you ask them first, do you want a network? Yeah, you can buy a network and then you play repeated trust games. Then the control effect might appear suddenly. Also,
Vincent,
that didn't.
if I may interrupt real quick, there's
Yes,
a comment in the chat which speaks to that and maybe adds another suggestion on how to get at that or manipulate something. Sijun suggests, what about if you put people in both the role of the trustor and the trustee in the game? So if they have experience also not just as trustor, but also as trustee, does that experience of the trustee role maybe would that make a difference for the control effects? Have you ever played with that idea?
yes, that is actually a good suggestion. And actually, in our first paper on the experimental study, we had subjects cycling through the roles. Yeah, so they played it as a trustee and then as a truster one and truster two who were in the network of the trust game with one trustee and two trusters. And so we had a group of people that started as a trustee and then did it as trusters. We had also who had trustee in the middle and who had trustee at the end. And actually, indeed, we came up with this idea. So is it the case that people who start as a trustee and then they actually, as a truster, they expect this network effect? Also there, we still could not find this network control effect for these trusters. Yeah, I have to say, let's say this, of course, then you also reduce the number of subjects that you have in these conditions because they are also limited, let's say, then a smaller proportion. So you lack also some statistical power. But let's say what we had in terms of data, this didn't seem to work. Yeah, but so also this idea of the network, choosing the network, actually also in the choosing this decision, let's say to some extent you saw that people have no clue, let's say, whether they should choose the network. Yeah, so that also speaks to that this anticipation is difficult. And then the consequence, let's say, that in the network condition there is more network control, let's say, didn't work out that well. I see some more things in the chat, but I think this was the main point.
Yes.
Going pretty fast through the slides. Oh yeah, so because this slide now I already discussed, so this is the related to the previous slide where there were the IDs, but here you see indeed the results that these things didn't work. And let's say so for the network control effect, for some reason that seems so complicated for trusters to realize, yeah, that all these increases of ways to make them able to understand the effect didn't get us to the effect. We might also think, let's say, the dyadic control effect, yeah, we find it mostly in these studies, but let's say maybe there are people who still find this anticipation difficult, for which it is not the case. Yeah, and so what we then started to see, let's say, can we not manipulate, in a sense, experimentally, let's say, the extent to which people are able to put oneself in the shoes of the other. Yeah, so we now really go into the more psychological part of these studies. And it is suggested that actually higher levels of testosterone inhibit people's ability to put oneself in the shoes of another person. Yeah, and studies that support that or in that direction is, for example, that people who are have a higher prenatal testosterone exposure, yeah, they have a higher likelihood to have autism. And let's say a more experimental type of study shows if you administer testosterone to female subjects, their ability to see emotions in somebody's eyes is reduced. Yeah, because these are individual studies that really on that mechanism. But of course, we can translate that to the trust game. Now, let me then detail on this is this prenatal testosterone exposure. Prenatal testosterone exposure actually is related to, let's say, the ratio between your fourth and second digit. Yeah, the longer your fourth digit, the higher your prenatal testosterone exposure. Yeah, this has led to a lot of suggestions, all kind of things of behavior that is related to your digit ratio. A lot of these findings are actually contested, but let's say the physical relationship that this exists is yeah find in several studies, and of course this we can measure in our participants as well. And this is the kind of task, let's say, for empathy in somebody's eyes. Yeah, so this is also a task. It's used a lot in psychology. You get a whole series of eyes with 4 types of emotions, and then you have to guess what the right emotion is. And apparently, let's say, people with the higher levels of testosterone, they are less able to recognize these emotions. Now, what did we do? Yeah, we focus now on the dyadic control effect. So we're going to compare one-shot trust games with repeated trust games. And we create a double-blind placebo testosterone condition. Yeah, so half of the people get administered testosterone, and the other half of the people get administered. Let's say they take this as a gel, the placebo. Yeah, and we also collect saliva, and through that you can really measure that this testosterone level is going to be increased. Yeah, this is a medical procedure. This is approved by Medical Ethical Committee for female participants. And the reason to do this with female participants is they have a very low and a very similar testosterone level all over. And if you administer, you can really have a good experimental variation between the subjects with testosterone administration and without. Yeah, well, if you would do that in males, it's difficult to overcome the natural variation in testosterones within males. Yeah, so it's much more difficult to get a clean comparison. And then these female participants, they play a series of 6 one-shot games, and they play a series of 6 times repeated trust game. Yeah, half of them start with the one game, other half starts with the other games. It's all nicely balanced. Yeah, we measure all kind of also individual measures, let's say with questionnaires, but the most important individual measure is this prenatal testosterone exposure. And of course, the hypothesis is that the dyadic control effect should be related to, or should decrease, yeah, for people with higher testosterone exposure. Now, what did we find in this study? And I now have split the group in 4. Yeah, so on the top we have the experimental condition, the placebo group, and at the bottom we have the testosterone group. Yeah, the placebo group, you see in both figures, let's say that where is the split, the median split between people with high 2D 4D ratio, that is the group with the low prenatal testosterone exposure, and the other side is the low 2D 4D, that is the high prenatal testosterone group. And in the placebo group, in both groups, you see actually that the repeated game, you have more trust, and in more trust in the repeated game and less trust in the one-shot game. Yeah, and all these differences that I mentioned, they are also significant in terms of, let's say, a multivariate statistical test. However, if we then go to the second row, in the testosterone row, yeah, we see that then for the low prenatal testosterone exposure, there's still this difference between repeated and the one-shot game, but in the one-shot game, in the high prenatal testosterone group, who had also testosterone administration, the difference between repeated and the one-shot game completely disappears. Yeah, so we see an interaction effect that the group, let's say, that had high prenatal testosterone and testosterone administration, basically the dyadic control effect completely vanishes, while it still appears for the other groups. And this is for the trusters. Yeah, and then we go to the trustees, where the control effect was always more present. And what we then see is, let's say, here in the first place, you see that the control effect is much clearer over all the groups. You also don't see that testosterone here is able to let the control effect vanish. Yeah, so the interpretation is also here for the trusters. It's still kind of difficult to realize, to anticipate, yeah, this control effect, to put themselves in the shoes of the trustee, to understand, yeah, that they can trust the trustee more in the repeated game. For the trustee, they basically only need to realize their own issue, that as soon as they abuse trust, let's say, they are not trusted anymore. Yeah, so they need much less anticipation towards the other person. And you see that this is also not, then their behavior is not affected by the testosterone levels. Now, what does this mean for my general conclusion? Yeah, so the main thing on the sociological effects is, let's say, trust and trustworthiness are affected by embeddedness. Yeah, by repeated games and by the networks in which people are learning, as well as control effects determine trust levels. Yeah, certainly also trustworthiness levels. There was only an issue with the network control effect for the trusters. But let's say if you look at these data, you also see that there is quite some individual variation in the trust levels. Yeah, it's certainly not that with the embeddedness conditions and so on, you explain all the variance that you have in the data. And what we have shown in the testosterone study is that some of these mechanisms really depend on specific individual variations, such as, let's say, empathy that people have. Yeah, in empathy in the sense of being able to put oneself in the shoes of the others. Yeah, and I think this interaction effect shows, yeah, how important it is that you do interdisciplinary research on these effects. So if you only study the sociological effects, let's say, you miss this variation to a large extent. So if you add to that, let's say, the more psychological elements and the psychological differences between the people and how they interpret the sociological effects, let's say, you understand your data and the mechanisms that are going on better. Yeah, and the last message that I want to repeat, let's say, we are quite confident on, let's say, the first bullet of these conclusions, because we have all these complementary studies with largely consistent effects. If I think about this interaction effect between the psychology and the sociology, this is still just one study where we find this. You have also seen not too many subjects. Yeah, so I think there and on that type of more complex mechanisms, we still need quite some more studies on to reconfirm this effect, to get an idea that this effect also works in the real world, and so on. And let's say, kind of, this is my final result from this. And let's say this is selection of the studies that have passed by. So you can look up all the details if you would like to.